Mr. Brendan Halley. Mr. Brendan Halley, and then there's Professor Ross R.
McKittrick, yes.
No paternity leave, Brendan? Oh, congratulations.
Bonjour, collègues.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope you had a good rest week in courts. Good morning, witnesses. Thank you for being here this morning.
It's in a hybrid format and is in public. We have witness testimony for the full 2 hours. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines for using earpieces written on the cards found on the table. Le comité reprend son étude de l'efficacité.
The committee is resuming its review of the effectiveness, potential improvements, and capacity of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan.
Meeting with the following witnesses. Professor Ross R. McKittrick, who is by video conference, and from Efficiency Canada, Senior Director of Policy Strategy, Mr. Brendan Halley.
Monsieur le Président, désolé, je n'ai pas de...
Pardon.
Mr. Chair.
Est-ce que vous êtes sur le bon canal
Are you on the right channel?
de vérification?
Let's do some checks.
Testing. Testing. Bon matin. Parfait. Est-ce que vous avez entendu les noms ou est-ce que vous voulez que
Did you hear the names, or do you want me to repeat them?
go straight to opening remarks and after that questioning witnesses? So, chacun des témoins dispose de 5 minutes.
Each of the witnesses will have 5 minutes for their opening remarks.
Which says you have 1 minute left, and after it says time is up. So that's when the clock stops ticking. So I'll start with Professor Ross McKittrick. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I hold a PhD in economics from the University of British Columbia, and since 1996, I've been a professor of environmental economics at the University of Guelph. In the early 1990s, I developed and published one of the first computable general equilibrium models of the Canadian economy, focused on modeling CO2 emissions and climate policy. Since then, I've published over 100 peer-reviewed academic papers and think tank reports on all aspects of climate change. During the Chrétien government years, I took part in multi-model assessments of the potential impacts of meeting Canada's Kyoto Protocol commitments. In those days, there were multiple published cost estimates from a diverse group of modeling teams, including Finance Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Infometrica. The work was coordinated by a federal entity called the Analysis and Modeling Group. By contrast, the current government has provided no information regarding the costs of meeting the Paris target. Neither Finance Canada nor NRCan have reconstituted the Analysis and Modeling Group, and to my knowledge, there are no published official cost estimates for the Federal Emissions Reduction Plan, or ERP. The ERP itself simply waves away the cost issue with vague promises of economic benefits from implementing the plan. I have published quantitative estimates of the costs of the ERP, or at least those elements that the government specified in enough detail to model. For this work, I developed a new, highly detailed computable GE model of the Canadian economy, which I have published in the peer-reviewed Canadian Journal of Economics. I estimate that the plan will get Canadian greenhouse gas emissions down by a little over halfway to the 2030 target, but at a cost of about 6% of Canada's gross domestic product relative to the base case. Note that the economy continues to grow, but at a slower rate. The carbon price is the cheapest and most effective component of the ERP. I estimate that by 2030, it would have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 18% compared to 2019 levels, and it would have reduced GDP growth by only about 0.1% per year. The Clean Fuels Regulation cuts twice as much off the growth rate as the carbon tax and only reduces emissions a third as much, while the remaining regulatory components, such as tightened building energy efficiency codes, the EV mandate, and so forth, are 3 times as costly as the carbon tax, while being only about 1/8 as effective at reducing emissions. And as you all know, the first thing Mr. Carney did after getting elected was to eliminate the consumer carbon tax. Whatever emission reduction policies are retained between now and 2030 will be costlier and less effective. But rather than go into further details about macro modeling results, I would like to turn to a simplified version of something called the Kaya identity, which breaks down annual CO2 emissions into 3 components: the emissions intensity of GDP, or emissions per dollar of output, real GDP per capita, and population. It shows that, to a close approximation, the annual percent change in CO2 emissions growth is the sum of the annual percent changes in emissions intensity, income, and population. In a report for the Fraser Institute in 2024, I showed how these 3 metrics have changed since 2005 and what the outlook is through 2030. In the figure accompanying my remarks, I have updated the numbers from the original sources to 2024. Canada's CO2 emissions changed very little, falling by less than 3% over the past 25 years. On our current trajectory, we are nowhere near meeting either the 2026 or the 2030 targets. Emissions intensity declined by about 40% since 2005, and for 20 years it has been falling by about 2% per year. It does not exhibit any apparent sensitivity to government policy. Instead, it is mainly driven by improvements in energy efficiency, which depend on long-term technological change. Real income per capita rose by about 19% over the past 25 years, which is a worrisome trend if your goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But fortunately, government policy succeeded in stopping its growth after 2022, and there is little prospect that Canadians' real income will rise again in the foreseeable future. Finally, population growth has accelerated to about 3% annually, 3 times its historical rate. Remaining committed to the 2030 Paris target will require an emissions cut of 36% from 2024 levels, so about 6% per year. If population growth goes back to 1% annually and emissions intensity continues to decline at 2% annually, all we require is for the government to ensure that real income per capita declines in Canada by about 5% annually for the rest of the decade. While I believe that outcome is within the capability of the present government, I do not recommend it.
Thank you very much. And we will start now the questioning. We will start with the Conservative Party for 6 minutes. Mrs. Asti, please. Oh, sorry. I guess I needed more rest for my week off. Sorry about that. We'll give you an extra couple of seconds just for that little error. So, Mr. Brendan Haley, the floor is yours. Thank you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So given the topic of the committee, I first want to say improving energy efficiency reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So a Dunsky Energy and Climate Consultants study estimated it could have contributed 25 to 35% of Canada's 2030 goals. A potential study by the International Energy Agency showed that energy efficiency could contribute 40% to Canada's energy needs in 2050 and make a similar percentage contribution to a net zero reduction goal. But what I mostly want to talk to you about today is all the other benefits of energy efficiency, particularly when it comes to a more productive and self-reliant economy. So saving energy, it can do the same thing as building a power plant, and often does it at lower cost. So for example, Hydro-Quebec recently published that it would cost it about 4 cents to save a kilowatt hour of electricity versus supply-side costs of 13 cents. So the Prime Minister's mandate letter calls for nation-building projects, and the discussion so far is focused on more physical infrastructure like pipelines, transmission lines. So I want to give you 5 reasons why I think adding energy efficiency to Canada's portfolio of nation-building projects would be a good idea. So first, it directly improves productivity. It means more GDP for every unit of energy consumed in Canada, with estimates of $4 to $7 of an increase in GDP for every $1 invested. Second, it can produce results in, say, 1 to 2 years. That's faster than any mega project I know of. It's also highly adaptable. So unlike a power plant, which has very fixed processes, rigid supply chains, it's possible to save energy across all sectors using multiple technologies, and we use engineering expertise, which can navigate around potential supply chain challenges. Third, it supports Canadian businesses and innovators. Energy efficiency, it's a very made-in-Canada energy option. It's found within our borders, it's found in our homes and industries, but then when we look at some of the materials used, things like insulation, things like fresh air equipment, they're largely manufactured in Canada. We have Canadian companies building internationally competitive businesses and innovating in areas like smart thermostats, pump and motor systems, natural refrigerants, carbon sequestering insulation, and heat exchange. With respect to intellectual property, industrial energy efficiency is the largest category of clean technology patenting in Canada. Building energy efficiency is the 4th largest category. It can also be a very tariff-proof and cost-cutting solution for industry. So if we look at, say, energy management systems, they use data to optimize industrial operations. They can often extend the life of existing equipment. So that can prevent a business from, say, having to make an emergency equipment purchase, which can be quite attractive right now. A 4th reason, energy efficiency is regionally fair. Energy savings are found throughout the country. And then finally, energy efficiency, it directly supports people in their homes and their businesses. So one way we improve energy efficiency is we make the choice to, instead of paying for power plants, we pay people to improve their efficiency to use less energy. That's, again, often lower cost than power plants and transmission lines. And so I would rather pay people instead of pay power plants. So my recommendation is to incorporate energy productivity and affordability into Canada's climate plan by making energy efficiency a nation-building project. That can be defined based on 2 goals. First is an energy productivity goal to double the pace of efficiency improvement. That would be measured by the amount of energy used to produce a unit of GDP. And second is an affordability goal, which should be eliminating energy poverty along with achieving net zero emissions. So these goals would define a nation-building agenda, one based on self-reliance, affordability, productivity. It would use local knowledge, use local businesses, and it would also reduce greenhouse gas emission reductions, or greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. 1 minute short, then time allocated. That's great. You'll have more time for the members to ask questions. So the floor is yours, Mrs. Astip. Thank you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Ross McKitrick, for your opening statements. Lots of technical language in there, but there's a point that you've made at the end of your opening remarks that I think is really important for Canadians to understand. And what I was thinking about as you were talking about your position is that a term I like to use in business, the juice is just not worth the squeeze. And you've pointed out that measures like the emissions cap and others only reduce emissions by about 2.3% annually, yet there's a serious cost to our economy and household incomes. Can you expand a little bit on what that trade-off means for Canadians and their everyday lives?
Yes, that is an important point I tried to get across, that different policies have different cost and effectiveness ratios. And unfortunately, the way the emission reduction plan was put together, the government listed, I believe, 140 different measures. And what they didn't do, though, was provide any cost information on those measures. And so they're leaving Canadians in the dark. They all sound good on paper, but when we engage in this kind of analysis and modeling work, it does become very clear that some of them are going to end up being extremely costly and largely ineffective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we could look at, well, the Clean Fuels Regulation would be an example where if the carbon tax, if the government that implemented the carbon tax really understood the logic of the carbon tax, they would also realize there is no reason to bring in the Clean Fuels Regulation on top of it. The economic logic of the carbon tax is such that you don't need these other regulations. If you really believe in the measure, what you end up doing is just trying to micromanage businesses and households across the country. and it's a temptation on the part of government. I think one of the overarching points that I was trying to make was that this government has really left people in the dark about the costs of what they're proposing. It is nothing like back in the days of Kyoto. There was, as I mentioned, there were 3 different independent modeling groups in the federal government working on detailed cost information. Nothing like that has happened, and so we're just asking Canadians to trust government policy proposals with no information about the impact on household budgets and businesses.
Thank you. I want to kind of bring this in specifically to a sector that's important to me, and I talk about it lots in this committee, and that is the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore. But also the Western Canadian energy sector also is a huge benefit to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. So as an economist, do you think that the Liberals have overlooked how Newfoundland and Labrador economically benefits not just from Western Canada's energy industry, but also the offshore when they develop and propose these policies?
By offshore, are you referring to offshore oil and gas?
Yes.
Yes. Well, like the Western energy sector, the offshore oil and gas sector in Canada requires a stable investing environment, and it requires commitments on permitting, and it requires an environment that makes it possible to have a predictable profit profile for these significant investments. And by the government moving towards a much more regulatory intensive approach rather than a predictable, in this case, a carbon price approach, it's a disservice to the East Coast energy sector, but really to all kinds of sectors in Canada that have to engage in long-term, multi-decadal planning intervals. And during the past election, there was a lot of talk about the fact that we just don't see these projects being proposed. And even when the government set up this new office for nation-building projects, they didn't have a lot of interest coming from the private sector. And this is because the long-term planning environment in Canada is so unfavorable, and it's because of this regulation-intensive approach and also the lack of information from the government about the costs of the regulations.
Yeah, so just one quick point on that then. Would you agree then that this emissions cap that is meant to implement these targets risk stalling the economic and development? It merits a full rethink because it compromises our competitiveness?
Yes, I think that's true. And to single out one sector and say we're going to put a specific cap on your sector, but not other sectors, it guarantees that whatever you achieve in emissions reduction will be at a higher cost than it otherwise needed to be.
So based on your experience as an economist then, do you believe that this proposed emissions cap is more likely to cause harm than benefit?
Yes. And I would quote the government's own figures on their estimated social cost of carbon. And in the research I've done, it shows that this element of the regulatory structure is far costlier than their own estimate of the benefits.
Thank you. I'm sorry, time is up. Monsieur Saint-Pierre, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Your organization, Efficiency Canada, produces provincial energy efficiency scorecards. One, can you provide this committee with the most recent scorecard? And in the latest scorecard, some provinces such as BC or PEI scored highly, and other provinces such as Alberta were on the lower end. Can you speak briefly about the role of provincial governments in meeting our 2030 targets, or how it helps to reduce emissions to meet our targets?
Yeah, as you said, we do this every couple of years. We do a pretty comprehensive analysis of energy efficiency policies at the provincial level. Provinces have the ability to implement building codes. They usually run things called demand-side management programs, which make the decision essentially of, are we going to build a power plant? Are we going to build a transmission line? Or does it make more sense to do energy efficiency and save energy instead? So some of the provinces that are high in that scorecard would be, as you mentioned, British Columbia. It has a building code that is moving towards net zero energy on a very predictable timeline. PEI is a great case. PEI is a real leader in low-income energy efficiency programs to tackle energy poverty, and I spoke to that in my remarks briefly. I mean, the other thing, so definitely I can provide the committee with that. The other thing we do is we kind of look at those provincial policy systems, and we then think about, well, how can the federal government play a truly value-added role? And a good example of that is a recent federal program for low-income energy efficiency called the Canada Greener Homes Affordability Program. We looked at what are the provinces doing, what are they not doing, where can they use extra help. They could use extra help in things like deeper energy savings, fuel switching, like things like upgrading if you have asbestos or if you have mold, dealing with those issues, because an energy efficiency program at the utility level often can't deal with that. So I think that's a good example of the federal government being able to play a value-added role, being able to do things the provincial level can't.
Quick follow-up question. Your organization also provided a sign-on letter to the federal government about the Greener Homes Loan Program. So can you provide a copy of that letter to this committee? And can you speak to the importance of this letter or the Canada Greener Home Loan Program?
Thanks. Yes, I'm happy to provide a copy of that letter. So the Greener Home Loan Program, it was a loan that provided zero interest loans. It was really the main way for middle income households to improve their energy efficiency and improve their greenhouse gas emission reductions. As I said, there's this low income program, which deals with specific barriers. But if you're middle income, a zero interest loan works quite well. So unfortunately, that program was essentially shut down, or the intake was closed on October 1st. And the letter that you're mentioning was a letter written months before that saying this is a good program to recapitalize, especially because the kind of start-stop nature of a program like that is very disruptive for the people who do the work, to the businesses that have developed business plans around a loan program like that. It also really doesn't help consumers. Consumers should be taking advantage of that loan when it makes the most sense for them, when their furnace dies, when they're replacing their siding, not kind of chasing government grants because they know they're going to go away.
Great, thank you. Dr. McKertrick, in 2002, you wrote a book called Taken by Storm, where in chapter 10 you said underneath the global warming issue is a general question of how to make good when the science is uncertain. One, can you provide a copy of that book to this committee? And secondly, do you still believe that the science of climate change is uncertain?
First question, I think I can. It's been out of print for a while, but I will see. On the second question, it's a very large issue. I guess I'd need you to specify. I've published on a lot of aspects of climate change, including some of the statistical issues involved. And yes, there's lots of, the journals are full of uncertain issues on climate change. I need you to be a bit more specific.
Running low on time, but there's an evangelical declaration on global warming from 2012. Did you sign on to that declaration?
I don't know. Again, I need you to be more specific. If I did, my name would be on it.
So it's this specific declaration with your name on it. The declaration says that we deny that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Do you still deny that CO2 or carbon dioxide is a pollutant?
I deny that it's an air pollutant in the same category as carbon monoxide or sulfur dioxide. It's not regulated. It's not listed as a pollutant in that framework.
So you're currently a fellow at the Fraser Institute?
Senior fellow, yes.
Senior fellow. Is it true that the Koch Institute funded Fraser Institute in the past?
You would have to ask them. I don't know. I'm not privy to that information.
Does the Fraser Institute receive any foreign funding?
Again, you'd have to ask them. I'm not privy to that information. My salary is paid by the University of Guelph. I'm not a salaried employee there, but again, you can find out from them where their funding comes from.
Maintenant, la parole est à Monsieur Bonnet pour...
Mr. Bonner, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. McKittrick, I'll continue in the same line of questioning. Could you tell the committee the income sources of the Fraser Institute? Inaudible for the interpreter.
1 second. Quand vous allez demander pour des documents, faudrait que vous...
When you request documents, you need to go through the chair. That way, the registrar would take note of the documents requested and make sure that the documents are received within the right timeline. If you do this way, we may not receive your documents in time. Mr. Chair, could you request that the income sources of the Fraser Institute be submitted to the committee? Thank you. Dr. McKittrick, to your knowledge, does the Fraser Institute receive money from oil and gas industries? To your knowledge.
I'm not involved in fundraising or budgeting. You'd have to ask them.
D'accord, merci. Je note votre...
Very well, your ignorance is noted. Mr. Haley, let me come back to the loans for innovation. These loans do not exist for the middle class. Do you think that this is a problem for our fight against climate change?
Services when they need them. And that means solutions for if you're middle income, if you're low income, and right now there's essentially no solution available from the federal government if you're middle income. And it's a bit of a mystery to me because it was a loan. Most of the money gets paid back. The fiscal cost was quite low. And so this kind of asset on the government books seems to be exactly the type of program that this federal government says they like, something that can be declared as an asset on the book and that you do pay a small interest rate subsidy. So it was a mystery to see it go away. The government right now is saying, well, it met its objectives, and I don't understand what the objective was of that loan program because all the buildings are not retrofitted. We haven't hit net zero in the building sector. There's still demand for the program. We haven't, transformed the market and created new business models. So it seems that the objective was to spend the money and then it's gone. So that's why one of the recommendations to my committee is to have some goals associated with energy productivity, but also some goals associated with energy poverty so that this low-income program that now exists doesn't just go away when the money runs out, that there's actually an objective associated with it.
Okay. Donc, pour vous, c'est un recul.
So you think this is a step back when it comes to our fight against climate change?
Absolutely. Getting rid of the Greener Home Loan Program is, not consistent with meeting net zero emissions. It also wasn't consistent with the promises made on the last Liberal platform, what Mark Carney wrote about in his book Values that actually identified home energy retrofits as a strategic and high productivity area for government investment.
Je voudrais revenir sur le
Let me come back to the Build Canada Homes program. In your opinion, should this include a condition concerning the construction of new buildings so that they respect the energy efficiency requirements?
That I've seen, no clear statement that as the government supports new homes, that there is going to be some sort of energy efficiency standard, associated with that. And so one thing the federal government could do is there's a national model building code, which the provinces adopt, and there's essentially a series of levels or tiers of that building code the federal government could say, Build Canada Homes is going to follow a schedule of energy performance, moving up those tiers at exactly the same kind of schedule that we would like to see the provinces do. That would be a really productive way to make sure those buildings are essentially built right the first time so that they have low operational costs. It would also, I would argue, be a way to accelerate the modernization of the construction industry, because things like prefabrication, things like modular homes, they are also very good at hitting high energy efficiency performance targets, things like air tightness.
Merci. Est-ce que selon vous, une...
Thank you. In your opinion, a sector target for buildings of homes, will this help us achieve our GHG targets in Canada?
You know, targets should be based on exactly what we want. So one thing that hopefully we can all decide we want is let's eliminate energy poverty in this country. You know, nobody should be poor because of a high energy bill, because they can't access services like air conditioning. So I would really encourage, you know, targets like that that really can mobilize the public as well.
Now the floor will go to the Conservative. Mr. Leslie, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McKittrick, the Liberals over the last decade have rolled out a laundry list of environmental schemes, but as you mentioned in your opening remarks, never have they told Canadians what any of it will actually cost, not to families, not to businesses, not to workers, and certainly not to the overall economy. As a professor of economics, holding a PhD, I'm hoping that you can help fill in some of the blanks on some of these specific policies. I'd like to start with the emissions cap. The government claims that it will not hurt Canadian energy producers. What do you think it will do to our economy?
I would first say that the burden of proof for that statement is on the government itself. And there are very competent economists within the government in places like Environment Canada and NRCan and Finance Canada who could generate information. And for all I know, they may even have done so. But that information hasn't been released to the public, which is a great disservice. As I've mentioned, imposing a cap on one specific industry that you don't impose on anyone else just guarantees that the cost of whatever you achieve has to go up. If the government trusted its own industrial carbon price and the output-based pricing system, if they understood the logic, they would understand that they don't need to supplement it with that kind of emissions cap. Now, in the specific case of CO2 emissions, it's very difficult to decouple fossil fuel use and CO2 emissions. That's not true of other emissions like carbon monoxide or particulates. You can decouple them. But CO2 emissions at this point is very difficult to decouple them. So imposing an emissions cap is very close to imposing a production cap. It may be possible at some point to engage in large-scale carbon capture and storage, but that isn't currently the case. So the emissions cap will ultimately, if it binds, turn into a production cap, and that, I think, has significant macroeconomic consequences, not only for the sector, but for the economy as well, given our reliance on energy exports.
Thank you. Now, we have heard the term energy poverty thrown around today, and I think it's a very real concern. Continuing on that vein of specific policies, the clean electricity regulations, do you have any sense as to how much this might drive up energy bills for Canadians?
Well, I have done a report in the Ontario case. One of the difficulties there is people will look at the generation cost of something like wind and solar, and they'll say, well, the fuel is free, so it's an inexpensive source of electricity. But you have to deal with the intermittency problem. And dealing with intermittency by saying, well, what would it cost to rely on wind and solar on a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year basis? Then you have to look into the costs of the storage facilities, and that's where the real cost drivers are in. So in Ontario, the provincial government brought in the Green Energy Act back in the middle part of the first decade of the century, promising that it wouldn't raise electricity bills. But we know that was not the outcome. The global adjustment has gone up considerably to fund, among other things, the cost of covering wind and solar FIT payments. My concern about energy poverty issues is that they do often conflict with climate policy goals. The climate policy goals need to be thought of in terms of minimizing the cost for the goals that are achieved. But once we get into these laundry lists of emission reduction plan type programs, the costs escalate very quickly while the effectiveness of the programs drops.
Thank you. Now, when officials from the Environment Department were before this committee recently, I asked if Minister Debruzen planned to back away from the 2030 emissions target, and they insisted that the department has not done that. Now, if that's true, the government will need to impose drastic new measures in the next few years to hit those targets. In your assessment, what would the economic fallout look like if we actually were successful in hitting those targets, and do you have any specific policies you could see the government undertaking to try to achieve that?
Well, as I say, our annual emissions growth is the sum of our population growth, income growth, and the change in emissions intensity. We can get emissions intensity down by about 2% per year, and that includes the benefits of improving energy efficiency. So it comes down to income and population growth. The government is also apparently committed to maintaining high levels of population growth. So I don't know how they reconcile their goal on emissions with their goals on population and income growth, given the limitation to improvements in energy efficiency on a year-by-year basis.
Thank you very much. Next, for 5 minutes, Mrs. Miedema.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here both. My question is for Mr. Haley. I'd like to pick up on this conversation of cost versus savings or positive return on investment. I spent a long time focused on energy efficiency in Halifax and saw the massive amounts of savings that focusing on efficiency has. And in fact, I know you were very much involved with the inception of Efficiency Nova Scotia. We have an efficiency utility in our province, and it actually led to not having to build a giant power plant, which was its goal, and it's still here today. Our Halifax plan, our climate action plan locally, actually showed a gain in financial benefit over time because we had energy efficiency as required throughout the 30 years. So not only were we going to be winning financially in the end, but we're not going to increase energy demand provincially. We weren't going to need anything from the utility to be able to do that as the municipality. So can you dive a little bit deeper on the economic benefits of energy efficiency and how that plays into our 2030 target? Thank you.
Sure. As I said, there's a report that I think I referenced in what I provided to the committee that essentially did an economic impact study of improving energy efficiency, kind of at a moderate pace and then at a more aggressive pace. I don't remember the job figures, right? But that's where that improvement of $4 to $7 of GDP for every $1 invested in energy efficiency, comes from. So it has an impact again in, GDP. More economic activity for less energy use, more outputs for less inputs. That's an improvement in productivity. That's what energy efficiency will do for you. And you can decide how to use that productivity. You can use it for more economic growth. You can use it for greenhouse gas emission reductions. You can use it for lots of other purposes. I'd say the kind of state of the art in thinking about the costs and benefits of energy efficiency, and actually Nova Scotia is now kind of leading on this right now, is thinking that energy efficiency is at lower cost than power plants, is at lower cost than transmission lines. I would say that is a very important thing to consider when we think about electricity systems and the impact of, say, things like investment tax credits, which tend to be more supply side focused and not so demand side focused. So for instance, you're potentially encouraging more expensive electricity options if you're neglecting the demand side. But the other real benefit is things like less money spent on healthcare. If you help someone out of energy poverty, if they can access cool temperatures in the summer, things like air conditioning, warmer temperatures in their home in the winter, that has health improvements, more improvements on healthcare, improvements in terms of productivity when you work in an office. That's energy efficiency, that has fresh air coming in. So these are kind of what we call the non-energy benefits, and most people call them, they're the benefits that a lot of people really want out of energy efficiency. It's things like comfort, healthcare improvements, productivity improvements.
That heat pumps can save lives, right, in the extreme heat we've been seeing across Canada. And energy poverty rates are actually highest in Atlantic Canada. So we think about this a lot, especially where there's really good opportunity to fuel switch from home heating oil to a heat pump because so many homes are still on it in Nova Scotia, although that number is decreasing. Energy efficiency seems to be a little bit of like an unsung hero, you know, like we have solar programs, they're shiny, people want them. The new shiny always gets the attention. I wonder if in your work you focus on how to tell the story more loudly and in a compelling way to get people to really think about efficiency first, not just as a homeowner, but as government and as industry at large. Thank you.
It's a good question. I don't think we should ever try to make energy efficiency sexy. We should just double down on it. It's totally unsexy, but it is extremely practical, and it helps you on your bills. It helps you, live in a more comfortable home. So, one thing I mentioned in my presentation is, what we can do? We can pay people instead of paying power plants, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Instead of building a power plant, let's pay people to be more energy efficient. To deal with some of the variability issues of renewables, we can actually store wind in people's electric cars. We can store wind in people's hot water tanks, and we can pay people for that service instead of paying a power plant for that service.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Maintenant, la parole est à vous, Monsieur Bonnet, pour 2.
Mr. Bonnet, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. The fact that the government abolished loans for green renovations, you said it has an impact on consumers. It's a step back in our fight against climate change. I have an impression it's also a problem for industries that are working in that domain. Could you tell us more about that?
Announced the Greener Home Program, which at the time was a combination of a grant and a loan. They encouraged people to become energy advisors. They said, you can now build a career as an energy advisor. And what energy advisors do is they're the people who go into your home, they look around your attic and your basement, and they find where you can get those energy savings that make the most sense and at the lowest cost. And then, right, they encouraged companies that install insulation, that install solar, to ramp up, to staff up, to train people, right? That program has only been in market for a couple of years. The promise, the implicit promise was that this was here to stay, was that people could build careers, right, in this industry. And now all those businesses are quite disruptive. They're quite disrupted, especially the energy advisors, I would say. And so the next time the government says, hey, we're going to have a loan program and we want you to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think those businesses are going to be less likely to train people, to hire people, because they can't deal with, businesses have trouble dealing with that kind of start-stop.
Est-ce que vous craignez d'autres?
Are you afraid that there may be other areas where we step back when it comes to the fight against climate change? And do you think that there are specific things you could recommend to be included in the budget?
This low-income efficiency program is a positive step that the government has taken. It is funded much less than that loan program was funded, much less than that initial grant program was funded. So the question everybody's asking now, is that program to deal with energy poverty, to help low-income people, going to just go out? We're going to stop when the money runs out, or are we going to actually have a target associated with it, a goal associated with it, something like eliminating energy poverty, so that we know when that new program can, do its job?
Could you tell us if Canada is a leader compared to other countries when it comes to green buildings? Green buildings.
Canada has a really long history of leadership in building science, in terms of the science, in terms of the patents and the science and the technology of making buildings, Canada's been a real leader in that. In fact, Saskatchewan developed the first super energy efficient passive house. But other countries have kind of stolen that leadership. It was really Germany that has been led in passive house. So I would say it's a similar story to other industries. Canada has the knowledge, we have the science, but we don't necessarily have the policy mix to make us a leader and to make us, really develop businesses in this area.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haley. And now Mr. Bexty for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I appreciate it. Professor McKittrick, you had a report in the Fraser Institute last year titled The Economic Impact of GHG Effects of the Federal Government's Emission Reduction Plan through 2030, and it showed employment impacts. These impacts were substantial. And under a full policy package, your model estimated 164,000 fewer jobs by 2030 compared to the baseline. Could you clarify which job categories or regions bear the largest impact?
Well, the detailed tables are in the report. Let's see, I have it here. So I should point out, first of all, that that's not unemployment per se. In this type of model, that's an equilibrium change. It means the demand for employment goes down. So there may be temporary unemployment. I would think, especially out west, there'd be temporary unemployment, but there would also be reemployment. I actually find some of the largest negative effects are in Ontario on employment. And in this case, again, it being a general equilibrium model, it tracks the secondary effects as well. The increase in the cost of doing business affects all regions of the country. But in particular, I found analyzing this as best I could, the complete package of policies being put forward by the government does have a big effect on the cost of doing business in Ontario. And that requires some relatively large employment reductions in order to clear the labor market. But Alberta and Saskatchewan also bear a significant burden, again, because of the shrinkage of the energy sector.
Clarify or further drill into that a little bit. What kinds of jobs are you talking about in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta?
There, I would have to say that I do have industry level information in the detailed tables. I can provide them to you. I don't have them at my disposal. This particular model doesn't distinguish employment types in the sense of skilled versus unskilled workers. I don't have that level of resolution in it.
Just from your professional, would you think trades and engineering specialties or finance and healthcare?
This would primarily affect trades, blue-collar workers. The service sectors tend to experience much smaller macroeconomic effects from these policies.
Thank you. Canada already faces one of the lowest projected GDP growth rates in the OECD, and your data kind of reflects maybe some of the reasons why, or your analysis. And in your view, does implementing an emissions cap on critical export industries risk deepening that stagnation?
That's a concern that I have, that not only do a lot of people work in our energy sector, but it's a massive component of our exports. And if we end up pushing back on that type of production, and as a result, we're not able to sustain the export volumes, then that's going to have a negative effect on our exchange rate, which will affect Canadians across the country. I know that's a live concern among people who analyze this. And again, I wish there was more detailed guidance from the government, because there are a lot of competent economists within the federal government who could speak to this. But yes, the emissions cap, as I say, it will turn into a production cap, and we need to understand that that's going to have far-reaching effects on our future growth prospects.
Could you comment, I mean, the emissions... There we go. Sorry, the microphone was challenging me. With the increased cost of doing business in Canada related to emissions taxation, where would you expect that investment to be going? You implied earlier there'd be a reduction in investment and there'd be a reduction in activity commensurate with that investment and a reduction in jobs. Where in the world is that investment going if it's not going to be done here?
The obvious answer there is the U.S. I mean, they've moved very quickly, for instance, on LNG export facilities and green lighting, new energy development. Yeah, the U.S. would be the primary destination.
Thank you. Well, for 5 minutes, the floor is yours, Mr. Fanjoy.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Haley, I want to direct my first question to you. Canadians are facing some rising costs, and it's created an affordability issue for which is felt most deeply by those in lower and middle incomes. And much of that affordability issue is driven by how much money they're paying for energy to heat their homes, to cool their homes, to get around, basic things. I'd like you to address, if you could, how energy efficiency, changing, using the technologies that are available to us today, how that changes the equation for affordability for Canadians.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So yeah, there's about 2 million households in energy poverty as we typically measured it. That's about 13% of households. Every single province is over 10%. Of their population is found in that situation. It's highest in Newfoundland and Labrador by the latest. So these are households that they really care about their energy bill. It impacts them when they see it. And when you provide an energy retrofit, I mean, a standard energy retrofit can usually reduce your energy use by 20%. A really deep energy retrofit can reduce your energy use by 50%. So it can make that bill affordable, essentially, right? But as I said, I think what's more important than that is that the other aspect of energy poverty is that are you getting adequate energy services? Are you able to actually heat your home appropriately in the winter? Are you in danger of extreme heat, right? That's another aspect of it, and so that we really shouldn't, forget about. And as I said, that can mean you pay for prescription drugs, that perhaps you didn't. That means you can afford food. That means, you maybe have lower healthcare costs, and all of us have lower healthcare costs. So those are, the effects. For middle income folks, I would say that what's more useful for them is stability, is a stable bill, right? And some of that stability also comes in, say, resilience against things like extreme weather, right? If the power goes out, can your home hold its heat? A more energy efficient home can actually hold its heat. So those are some of the issues I think we see in other types of households.
Thank you. What Canada, is slowly adopting technology. Some places are moving faster than others. I'm encouraged by heat pump adoption. I have one myself. Solar, we see more and more examples, but I think it's fair to say that Canada is moving too slowly, and the fact that we're not exceeding targets yet is a testament to that. Why is that? What are the policy levers that you think governments at all levels may be missing in order to help Canadian citizens, businesses, and the economy as a whole move faster?
I think the real thing we need to think about is changing business models and changing the way we actually do the kind of retrofit process, right? So the standard HVAC company, what they tend to do day to day is they respond to emergencies. Your furnace breaks down, they replace your furnace. Your air conditioner breaks down, you replace your air conditioner. And there's so much lost value in that type of business model. We could change that business model so that that person actually becomes more of a consultant. They plan for when your furnace is going to break down and perhaps replace it with a heat pump, right? They perhaps do the insulation and the air sealing before so that the heat pump can be right-sized. Those are the types of business models we would like to see, and I think that would be quite transformative. So, the government, instead of, providing simply just grants and loans, we should really be thinking about how do we try to encourage that type of business model change? How do we also perhaps not just think about retrofitting one house at a time, how do we think about what kind of economies of scale can happen when we retrofit, entire neighborhoods?
This puts an end to this panel, so I would like to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, and the witnesses are excused, and the meeting will suspend while we prepare the next witness panel. les améliorations possibles à la capacité du plan de réduction des émissions pour vers 30. The committee is meeting with the following witnesses. Mr. Damon Matthews, Professor, Concordia University, Interim Director, Future Earth Canada, and Mr. Ron Wallace, former member, National Energy Board, by video conference. So for the witnesses, when you see my yellow flag going up, it's this indicating you got 1 minute left, and this indicating time is up. So I will now leave the floor to Mr. Matthews for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee.
I'm happy to field questions in French. This committee has heard many perspectives and arguments over the past weeks, but despite the debate, I don't think we are actually debating whether the emissions reduction plan is too weak or too expensive. It seems to me that we're really debating whether Canada should have an emissions reduction plan at all, or indeed whether the climate problem is important enough to warrant action. And I think this is the fundamental barrier to progress. We are still debating the seriousness of the problem. That this is still happening is both a failure of the climate science community and a triumph of the oil and gas industry. Because if we all truly understood the gravity of the crisis and what is actually at stake, there would be no debate about whether Canada should act. There would be no question that climate policy measures in Canada are woefully weak. There would be widespread dismay that Canada's economic well-being remains so dependent on a source of energy that will become obsolete within our lifetimes. I don't think we would be sitting here debating the individual merits of a set of insufficient policy measures. We would instead be putting all of our minds to the challenge of how to drive down emissions, diversify our economy, and protect the most vulnerable among us from the climate damages that we will not be able to avoid. I'm a climate scientist at Concordia University, and I've spent the past 20 years researching the fundamental relationship between human greenhouse gas emissions and climate warming. I have acted as an IPC author, provided expert input to legal proceedings, and served on climate advisory boards. Because it's worth saying over and over, there is no scientific doubt as to the cause of climate change. We all burn fossil fuels to produce energy. This produces greenhouse gas emissions, and global temperatures will continue to increase until this stops. It is also becoming increasingly clear how dangerous climate changes can be. Global temperatures have now exceeded 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and on our current trajectory, we will breach the 1.5 degree temperature limit in about 5 years. But it doesn't end there. Every additional increment to global temperature increase will drive more severe and more dangerous climate impacts. These impacts are already visible all around us. Intensifying wildfires, floods, and heat waves carry the clear signature of a warming climate. What we are witnessing across the country is not a new normal. It is the beginning of a transition to global climate conditions that have not existed in the history of human civilization. There will be losses for everybody. The town of Lytton burned to the ground a few years ago. Though it pales in comparison, the ability to skate on the Rideau Canal is unlikely to survive another decade. And beyond the direct physical impacts, climate change is also a threat multiplier. Climate damages increase the cost of living, strain societal resources, and can feed social conflict and instability. Global food systems, freshwater resources, and commercial supply chains are all feeling the effect of rising climate risk. And all of this is alarming, but it is not surprising. The climate changes we are experiencing are very much in line with climate model predictions. What is surprising is that the scientific reality of our changing climate remains a subject of political debate. Given the growing threat that climate poses, I would argue that it is irresponsible to start rolling back the halting progress we have managed to achieve over the past decade. This is especially true given that there are so many policy options available that would enable real progress on emissions reductions while also benefiting our economy and well-being. Major infrastructure projects are key. The decisions we make now will set the trajectory for future greenhouse gas emissions for decades to come. Expanding our national electricity grid, electrifying transportation systems, and expanding renewable energy generation across the country would all direct us towards a thriving low-carbon economy. Subsidies and incentives are also needed to help Canadians make low-carbon choices for our buildings, residences, and transportation needs. If we do not align around the need for ambitious climate policy, we risk missing a tremendous opportunity the benefits of climate action, not just in avoiding climate damages, but also direct improvements to cost of living, security, health, and ecosystems far exceed the costs of inaction. We have an opportunity to set a course for a prosperous future and a stronger economy for all Canadians. And this is what strong and ambitious climate action can achieve. Thank you.
Mr. Matthews, and now Mr. Wallace. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The November 2024 draft regulations that proposed an emissions cap on Canadian oil and gas is unquestionably an international policy outlier. No other oil-producing country, including Norway, which is often cited for its climate leadership, has implemented a sector-specific emissions cap for oil and gas production. These regulatory limits target a sector that is vital to Canadian GDP. There are estimates that the cap could shrink Alberta's economy alone by 11% by 2050 and reduce its government revenues by almost 10%. Today, my brief focuses on one consequence of the proposed Canadian emissions reduction plan, specifically proposals to produce decarbonized oil in Western Canada by use of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, projects. Proposed policies to decarbonize Western Canadian oil are not only wrong for the West, they are unfair and will incur harm to the Canadian national economic interest. These policies disincentivize investment in Canadian export pipelines. They also compel material capital investments and parallel subsidies for projects that have questionable economic and technical viabilities. One would expect Canada to have a consistent national energy policy. However, it appears that Canada is about to embark on two quite different energy policies, one for the East and one for the West. For new Western Canadian oil export pipelines, Canada is proposing to require that oil be decarbonized. Meanwhile, as federal legislation has banned tanker exports from the Northwest Coast, tankers bearing undecarbonized oil from offshore are freely allowed to ship oil into Eastern Canadian refineries. There are significant policy and cost implications here because Western Canadian decarbonized oil would have to be produced and transported to competitive world markets under a unique regulatory burden. Moreover, is oil produced and exported from markets from the Canadian Atlantic offshore region, for instance, from those production platforms, is that oil required to be decarbonized? Similarly, Eastern Canadian refineries continue to import oil from the USA in offshore jurisdiction, free from any comparable regulatory burdens. For instance, in October of this year, nearly 6.5 million barrels of West Texas, Saudi, and Nigerian crude will arrive at the refineries of Quebec City and St. John. Is this oil decarbonized? And are the emissions from refining or tanker transportation accounted? Significantly, if Canada does indeed adopt decarbonization as part of an emissions reductions plan, we do have the engineering talent and the expertise required to construct and operate such massive decarbonization facilities. Hence, it is not a question of whether we can decarbonize, but whether we should compel Canadian producers, aided by significant tax incentives, to funnel billions into CCS schemes. Recalling that in addition to the required front-end capital cost of some of these projects, estimated at from $16 to $24 billion, such massive projects would incur unavoidable operating costs. These are unrecoverable costs that Canada would impose on itself, and meanwhile, none of Canada's heavy oil supply competitors face these costs, and no other country is paying that cost. Can Canada afford this? There are material negative and economic implications for an emissions cap on Canadian oil that entail parallel consequences that decarbonization would pose. Fortunately, there are alternative methodologies that could represent a more pragmatic approach to CO2 sequestration. For instance, BC C-59 earmarked $12 billion in tax credits to reduce the upfront cost of investment in carbon capture equipment, but it specifically excludes a proven method for carbon sequestration to use CO2 enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, from eligibility from its carbon capture, utilization, and storage. In closing, I would say that Canada needs a consistent policy for emissions, not two. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. And now the floor is for you, Mr. Bexte, for 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I appreciate your time today. Dr. Wallace, I mean, you've spoken about the impact of decarbonizing oil. Could you expand a bit on, how that places in the impact of Canada vis-a-vis our competitors in the world? Where is the investment going to go, and what's going to be the impact on global production and global emissions?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you for it, Mr. Bexte. I want to just touch on, pick up some points that Dr. McKittrick made earlier. Clearly, he indicated in his testimony that, and by the way, in the report that I submitted, the more detailed report that I submitted to you, I have shown some of those figures. I would refer you to that report. But it's clear, let me just echo Dr. McKittrick's comments. Energy economist, for instance, Peter Terzakian, estimates that the Canadian energy industry and governments have forfeited almost $70 billion Canadian over 15 years because of the discount on heavy oil related to our lack of pipeline access to international markets. So there's two components to the question that you've asked. It's how much the economy of Canada has suffered because of this lack of international markets. And of course, the total amount of money that is flowing from Canada into the United States. I believe there are some estimates that indicate over $700 billion has flowed out of Canada towards the United States. I want to just pick up on one other component to this question, and that is Dr. McKittrick mentioned the fact that very few government estimates are showing Canadians what the true direct costs of some of these measures will bring to them. And when we talk about energy affordability, the best way to deal with energy affordability is to reduce the price of energy. We're now looking at potential costs for decarbonization, which would have to be subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer. There are some estimates that indicate that those direct costs of subsidies may range from $1.1 billion up to $4 billion a year. That cost, that additional cost of decarbonization that would be imposed upon the industry, is obviously either going to have to be paid by taxpayers or picked up by the international market. The international market will not do that. It'll be based on international prices. I hope that answers your question.
Very much, Dr. Wallace. That's a little bit concerning, right? On ultimately, it's going to go onto the consumers. Would you say, in outlining the description that you gave about the East-West dynamic, could you comment more on the federal government's emission policy and how it's effectively creating a two-tier system between both East Coast producers and Western producers and the refiners? What is that going to do to the price at the pumps and affordability?
Well, affordability all goes to the cost of production and the netbacks that are available to the industry. Industry is not going to be able to invest in something that it can't sustain a profit from. And if these measures are imposed upon the industry, either the industry will not invest or it will have to be subsidized. And as I've said, I've given you the numbers on what those subsidies would and could amount to. In terms of the East-West dynamic, as I've said, when we're importing the volumes of oil And in my report, I talked about the quantification of what those numbers are. The cost to the Canadian economy are to import that oil from offshore. It's in the many billions of dollars. When we look at the front end capital costs of decarbonization facilities ranging up to $24 billion, in effect, what we have said, we'll be saying to Western Canadian producers is that before you have the option to enter the regulatory process to build a $20 to $30 billion pipeline, you must pay $16 to $24 billion in advance for decarbonization, and then sustain that operation and its costs for operation. My question back to you is, do you think that there would be any private sector investors that would come forward to enter that kind of a process?
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. I would just quickly, could I ask the chair to ensure that that report is included in the proceedings? Then could you comment at the very end or expand more on what the potential benefit for an enhanced oil recovery, including that in the regulations, and the benefit to society versus the costs?
Well, it's remarkable that Bill C-59 earmarked $12 billion in tax credits to reduce upfront costs for carbon capture equipment, but then specifically excluded a proven method which has been operating in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, of carbon sequestration to use CO2 enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, from any eligibility in the carbon capture, utilization, and storage investment tax credit. Those numbers could unlock many billions of dollars in investment by the private sector to use alternative methods for sequestration and carbon capture.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace, and thank you, Mr. Bexty. Now, for 6 minutes, Mr. Grant.
Yes, and thank you both for coming and being here today. Mr. Matthews, when you spoke, I think the question is a policy too weak or too effective is one that we need, or not effective enough is one that we need to ask. And then you're talking about the history as well. And I thought back to my childhood growing up on the west side of Vancouver. You mentioned the Rideau Canal, not being able to skate. We were able to skate on ponds in golf courses, even up to the 1970s and 80s. There's actually home movies of me skating on ponds because that was the fun thing to do. But I don't think my kids will ever be able to do that. Hopefully they will be one day, but they haven't been able to do that. And also growing up on the mouth of the Fraser River, fishing for salmon, fishing for a fish called ulican that we are not able to fish anymore. And we know direct impacts of climate change that has increased the temperatures of those. So my first question, sorry, and I've got old eyes. I've got to take my glasses off to read my notes here. The 2024 emissions estimate shows progress is stalled. Canada's 2030 climate target may be out of reach, and the Canadian Climate Institute points out that Canada did not advance towards its emissions targets in 2024 and suggests 4 ways that Canadian emissions could be brought down. These are action to modernize industrial carbon pricing, finalization of new methane regulations for oil and gas, investment in clean electricity, and making cleaner fuels and vehicles more affordable and widely available. Which of these do you think is most readily implementable at this moment?
I mean, I think all of them need to be implemented, and more. Those are a subset of recommendations based on a particular analysis. I think there are many other policy levers that also need to be explored. When I mentioned infrastructure in my talk, one of the things I've spent quite a bit of time researching is the effect of infrastructure projects on committed future emissions. And when we're building now, we're building equipment and infrastructure that's going to last for decades and is going to either produce or not produce greenhouse gas emissions over that period of time. So I would, again, point back to that as probably the single most effective policy lever at play, that we need to be building, renewable-based electrified systems that will actually set us on the course that we want to achieve.
You said there are many others. Are there any others that you think would take top priority to be implemented soon that aren't on the list that I put forward? It doesn't have to be exhaustive.
I think Canadians want to make low carbon choices, and it's actually very difficult and sometimes very expensive to do that. So, I mean, again, I would point to incentives to assist those choices and to enable them to be rolled out across the country. Transportation is one of the biggest sources of emissions, and so anything we can do to electrify the transportation systems, whether that's personal vehicles, trucks, or intercity rail, would be, I think, a really important step in the right direction as well.
Thank you. Under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, the minister must set a national greenhouse gas emissions target for each milestone year with a view to achieving the national greenhouse gas emissions target for 2050, which is net zero emissions. What are the consequences if reporting shows that Canada is not on track to meet their targets?
I mean, international shame is one consequence. I mean, despite what you hear south of the border, most of the world is actually pushing ahead very rapidly with clean energy and emissions reductions. I think the emerging markets in China and Europe are really moving quickly in that direction, and we're going to have a hard time building those trade relationships if we're obviously seen as a laggard internationally in climate progress.
And you mentioned the electrical grid across the country. We often hear about the importance of it, but what tools or partnerships would be necessary to overcome jurisdictional barriers and make that a reality?
I mean, I think there's lots of willing partners. I mentioned the political debates that are going on right now. I think interprovincial agreements are actually really important. We don't have political consensus across the country right now as to whether or not these things should actually be done. And until we achieve that, it's going to be really hard to make the type of progress that is needed.
You talked about the town of Lytton that it burned down, and there are many First Nations around there as well that have been devastated, and unfortunately rural and remote communities are often adversely impacted. So to what extent does the 2030 emissions reduction plan reflect the circumstances of Canadians living in rural and remote communities, including Indigenous communities, in terms of impacts to climate change and the feasibility of emissions reduction strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the priority for remote communities has to be building resilience to climate impacts. The major sources of emissions across the country are not from rural communities; they're from major urban centers and industry. So if we can focus on driving those emissions down as fast as possible, including from the oil and gas sector, and then directing resources towards shoring up the resilience of remote communities, I think that would be the best strategy to go forward at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
Mr. Grant, Monsieur Bonnet, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Bonnet, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Matthews, could you explain to us the differences between limiting temperature rise to 1.5%?
Yes.
Impacts of climate change get worse and more severe the more temperature increases, and many of those impacts, increase very steadily as a function of global temperature increase. So it's not just 1.5 versus 2; it's actually 1.5 versus 1.6 versus 1.7, and it does look like we're going to cross the 1.5 degree threshold. I can't really see any way of avoiding that at this point. I said something very different 5 years ago, but 5 years is a long time in relation to this particular target. So, if we miss 1.5, we have to set our sights on the next one, which is 1.6. And if we miss that, then 1.7. Every increment of avoided warming will decrease climate damages. And those damages emerge from, all sides, from floods, heat waves, wildfires. Increasingly, coastal sea level rise is going to be an issue as well.
I imagine that this rise in temperatures affects Canada as well.
Yes, Canada is warming about twice as fast as the global average, and that pattern accelerates the further you move north. So northern Canada is maybe more like 3 to 5 times the global average. So yes, Canada is vulnerable, particularly in the north, and this is where resilience and adaptation measures are critical.
Could you please remind us? I think that the Paris Agreement target is to reduce temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less than 1% Celsius. Could you please remind us of those objectives or targets? What does it take in terms of emissions reductions by 2030 and 2050 if we wanted to respect the target?
Target is well below 2 degrees. I think it's very important to distinguish that from 2 degrees. 2 degrees itself is not well below 2 by definition. And so, and with an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. Globally speaking, this means emissions need to, be approximately halved every decade. And so, something like a 45 to 50% reduction relative to 2005 or 1990 targets, depending on where you are, would be appropriate. Although there is also an equity issue at play, and it's widely understood that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities implies that rich countries should actually be moving faster than the global average. And so, for a country like Canada, we are actually well behind our international obligations for the Paris Agreement targets.
Still on that, it's a common responsibility, even though it's different. So an industrialized country like Canada should do more and very quickly than developing countries. Is that planned for or provided for in the Paris Agreement? Is it a responsibility?
Principle dates back actually to the 1992 Earth Summit in Brazil, which was the event that initiated the entire UN Framework Convention process. So yes, it's deeply embedded within the Paris Accord that rich countries, wealthy countries, should be leading the way and moving on climate mitigation more rapidly than the rest of the world.
In your opinion, with the current emissions reduction targets for GES by 2030, the ones for Canada, do you think that they are sufficient for Canada to do what it needs to do if we want to respect the Paris Agreement?
I don't believe that to be the case. I think various advisory parties had recommended more ambitious targets, and those ultimately were not adopted. And so, I mean, I'm supportive of the fact that they are there at all. Obviously, it could be a lot worse, and we absolutely need to resist calls to weaken those targets. But as they stand now, no, they are not in line with our international obligation to achieve 1.5 degrees.
Mr. Chair, is it possible for those studies or references to be submitted to the committee, those that are referring to what Canada's target should be? Mr. Chair, this is a question for you and the registry. Thank you. Thank you. If we were to look at the oil and gas sector in Canada, what should be done, in your opinion, with this sector so that they should do their part within the country to reduce emissions, which are rising?
I mean, I think the oil and gas emissions cap is a good start. Ultimately, emissions from the oil and gas sector need to decrease in line with other sectors of the economy in order to achieve our long-term targets. I mean, I would say we actually should be focusing our attention on diversifying other forms of energy production and making solar, wind, and hydro energy more affordable and more economically viable across the country.
Considering the current situation, if we were to meet the targets, Canada is not headed towards achieving its target. So in your opinion, is it possible for Canada to make corrections in order to achieve those targets?
The outcome of the next few weeks, honestly, as to whether we achieve any kind of political consensus on the need to increase the strength of policies. The policies as they currently stand are not sufficient to get us to the target.
Merci, Monsieur Bonnet.
Thank you, Mr. Bonnet.
Mrs. Asti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, witnesses. Mr. Wallace, in your paper, The Divisive Effect of Two Regions, you describe how federal climate and energy policies have essentially created a two-tier system. One that penalizes domestic oil producers, while, on the other hand, allowing imported oil to enter Canada without facing the same regulatory costs. Now, I come from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which produces responsibly regulated offshore oil that directly supports Canadian jobs and government revenues. So what does the imbalance mean in practical terms as it relates to imported oil?
Well, thank you for that question. And I'm proud to say I helped work on the Hibernia project in my younger days. And it's wonderful to see that production capability in Eastern Canada. Your question is relates, but my point relates to consistent energy policies for Canada and policies which benefit Canadian producers as opposed to benefiting external suppliers. Our largest trading partner is the United States, 70%. It's also our largest competitor in the energy field. And as I said in my introductory comments, there's a lot of that West Texas oil coming up by tanker into Montreal and into New Brunswick. That's competing directly with the oil that's being produced in your jurisdiction and also in Western Canada. But it's coming in at a premium and at a real benefit. There's no decarbonization of the tankers that come up. There's no quantification of it, and there's no quantification of the amount of carbon that's produced in the refining sector, nor is there any decarbonized oil coming in on those tankers. So for Canada to impose that kind of a restrictive covenant upon specifically upon Western Canadian oil and gas production is going to have a very material effect on our competitiveness on the international stage. As I've said, the international oil price, which by the way is declining very rapidly, is going to be threatening not only Canada's export capacity, but our ability to produce oil and gas for our own internal purposes. And when we're burdening our economy with that degree of money that's flowing offshore to bring that oil into our Eastern Canadian refineries, while we've effectively burdened the Western Canadian producers, this puts us at a real disadvantage as a nation.
And also based on that, wouldn't you also agree that investment into offshore projects and exploration would be more beneficial for our economy than relying on these imports?
Well, sure. Canada's tended to focus on the potential economic impacts of climate change. This is a pressing issue that's emerged since the impact of declining direct foreign investment in the energy sector. These divestments that are happening in Canada reflect the concerns of major international investors, not just Canadians. In 2024, the flow of Canadian net investment reached a negative record $36 billion. This indicates that international investment capital is increasing, seeking jurisdictions other than in Canada. Those jurisdictions are producing competitive oil. The material decline in direct foreign investment in Canada has contributed from 2015 to 2024 to a very diminished GDP growth of 2% for Canada as compared to 14% in the United States. These are economic issues that Canadians should be aware of and that our decision makers and policy makers should be taking into account.
So just quickly then, on those points then, in your view, would removing the emissions cap be a part of the solution?
Well, the question is how you implement an emissions cap, how you implement an emission cap that is consistent and fair across jurisdictions, and one that benefits the Canadian economy. If Canada has inflicted itself with an emissions cap while importing non-decarbonized oil, that's a very difficult situation for our economy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Thank you, Mrs. Asti. Monsieur Saint-Pierre, la parole est à vous pour 5 minutes.
Merci.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, 5 minutes. Dr. Matthews, I am a graduate from Concordia University, so I'm always proud to see someone from my alma mater appear before us. I have a question for you because you've done a lot of modeling work on climate change. My question is Quebec respecting its targets for emissions reduction by 2030?
Is closer to achieving its target than the country as a whole. I don't have the exact trajectory in my head to give you a more precise answer than that, but Quebec has a lot of advantages. Obviously, the electrical system is already highly decarbonized. Sorry, I can't not comment that actually it's not possible to decarbonize oil. Speaking of decarbonized energy sources, that's a bit like trying to deoxygenate air. It removes the entire use of the compound. But in any case, Quebec does have some advantages, but also challenges. I mean, transportation and buildings are the largest source of emissions, so that's where Quebec is also further ahead in terms of electrifying transportation than the other provinces, but there's still work to be done.
Parfait. Aussi, est-ce que vous pouvez commenter mon collègue?
My colleague talked about
Concept of reducing emissions globally. Est-ce que vous pouvez commenter sur la juste part?
Could you talk about what Quebec could do to achieve its fair part, its fair share?
Fair shares within countries. I would, the absence of a better answer, I would say that Quebec's fair share is sort of equivalent to Canada's on a per capita basis. Or alternately on an emission shares basis. I mean, there's different ways that you can break it down, but ultimately the entire country needs to achieve net zero emissions by a particular date, and so Quebec has that same obligation.
Puis, est-ce que vous pouvez commenter sur l'importance?
Could you talk about the importance of provinces compared to the federal government, what they could do to reduce emissions by 2030?
I think federal government can incentivize and leverage action at the provincial level, but the provinces have jurisdiction over energy, which is the big producer of emissions across the country. So, I mean, yes, provinces need to act equally ambitiously, if not more so in some cases, than the provincial government or the federal government.
Puis vous avez fait beaucoup de travail aussi.
You've also done a lot of work on carbon budgets. Could you please comment the importance of the carbon budget? What's the difference between the carbon budget and the 2030 ERP targets?
The concept that total emissions of carbon dioxide are the quantity that determines how much warming occurs. And so you can have an emissions target and you can approach that target, in different ways. And those different pathways will give you different total amounts of CO2 emitted and other greenhouse gases. And so you will actually produce different amounts of climate warming depending on how you approach the target. Whereas the carbon budget approach, if applied as it has been in countries like the UK, for example, set a limit on the total quantity of CO2 and other greenhouse gases emitted, not on a particular target at a particular moment in time. So it's a much more tractable and accountable way of tracking and reporting emissions that actually gauges correctly the climate impact of those emissions.
We're also hearing about the perceived cost of climate policy, but can you speak to the cost of climate inaction?
I mean, we are seeing the cost of climate inaction across the country almost monthly. Insurance premiums are going up across the country. The insurance industry in general is very aware of these costs as a the threat to their industry and their ability to provide coverage. Wildfires and heat waves. Heat waves are probably the leading cause of mortality from climate change, but wildfires and floods obviously cause huge damages that are linked to climate change, and so the costs associated with those damages are all part and parcel of the cost of climate inaction.
Et si on pourrait choisir une politique ou deux fédérale?
If we were to choose a federal policy to help us reduce our emissions, what will you choose?
I would say that every new piece of infrastructure that we build needs to be carbon free.
Merci, Monsieur Matthews. Monsieur Saint-Pierre. Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Thank you. Mr. Bonnet, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand that you would recommend that we learn from the UK when it comes to implementing a carbon budget. Are there other measures in the UK or in other countries that you would recommend when it comes to governance or the management of an emissions reduction plan?
As a very, competent and well-respected climate change committee that has, among other things, been responsible for recommending the adoption of the carbon budget approach. Among industrialized nations in Europe and North America, the UK is on track to achieve its emissions targets, which is a rarity. So not only have they set carbon budgets for every 5 years and adhered to those, they are actually ahead of their proposed emissions targets. So, it has to do with mostly decarbonizing the energy supply system, in addition to all the other things that can be done around promoting energy efficiency and low carbon choices for consumers.
Ma question est pour Monsieur.
My question is for Mr. Wallace. I've heard you talk about the importation and exportation of oil. I think Canada exports twice the oil we consume. Do you have any figures when it comes to the oil we import and export?
Excuse me, I had to unmute. Thank you for your question. I don't have figures at hand. However, as I noted in my introductory comments, I did provide a report to the committee, and I believe that some of those figures may be. I won't bore you by going back into that report. I would just refer you to it, if I may.
Merci.
Thank you. You also talked about the carbon capture and sequestration. I think there's a project in Canada by Shell on carbon capture and sequestration. Is there a project developed in Canada, and to what extent are they capturing emissions? I think they had a certain percentage of carbon sequestration. And what does it cost per ton for these projects?
Well, there is a very good example, which I refer to again in my report, that's been operating in Saskatchewan, which is an EOR, enhanced oil recovery, where the sequestration of the carbon is reinjected and oil at pressure is forced back up. This is a very positive situation. Thank you, Chair.
Pardon. Mrs. Asti for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Wallace, you've emphasized the need for realistic, evidence-based energy policy. So I'm just curious about your thought about this, but if there's no credible path to achieving the proposed Liberal emissions cap without major economic disruption, shouldn't that policy be withdrawn or fundamentally rethought?
Thank you, Member Endesty. I appreciate that. I would say that Canada needs to carefully reconsider climate policies because it's encountering a sea change in dealing with policies, not just in the United States, but in Europe itself. Britain and Germany have been very committed to these types of climate policies, and their results are very significant negative economic impacts to their economies. And so the recent change in the engagement finding in the United States to repeal that is going to have a significant effect on climate and economic policies around the world. As Dr. McKittrick said, we need to understand the cost of some of these programs that has been put forward, and those costs are not being presented, in my view, to the Canadian public. There's another comment that I would have too, and that is, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that private sector interests will ultimately determine any new investments in Canadian energy systems. And I refer you to comments from CEO Greg Abel of Enbridge, who said for us to be willing to seriously considering reinvesting in projects in Canada, whether it's east, west, or just west, we need to see real change on numerous fronts. A lot of coordinated federal and pan-provincial legislative and regulatory action will be required before we think investors, management teams, or customers would be willing to greenlight such major investments.
Question: if our largest trading partner is ramping up production and prioritizing energy affordability, does it serve Canada's national interest to impose an emissions cap that chokes off growth and undermines our competitiveness?
Well, I think that's a very straightforward answer to that. Let me just talk about LNG exports, which Canada has finally entered the international game. And we have now entered also the international oil export game in the Pacific with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. All of the previous predictions for the export of that oil were wrong. There's much more of that oil than was predicted going to Asia, up to 50% now, than was originally projected. And of course, we're very far behind the United States in our LNG system. The Americans have redoubled their investments in LNG, and that has now become a major export destination for the European Union. So without answering your question with a yes or no, I would say, given those realities of the economics of what is happening from existing export of LNG and oil and gas, I think the answer is being answered by the international marketplace.
I'm going to concede the rest of my time to my colleague, Mr. Leslie.
Thank you, Ms. Anstey. Mr. Chair, I would like to move the motion that was circulated on Friday regarding the global carbon tax that Canada has quietly supported, despite claiming that they don't. For those of us that weren't here last year, the Minister of Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, appeared at this committee, and I asked him about being, quote, very supportive, as per a news article, regarding the global carbon tax. He went on to say that the Liberal government would not support a new carbon tax on international shipping, followed up by a tweet saying that he, quote, they had not supported any such level.
A point of order. Can I ask that we suspend to discuss this matter, please?
Suspend. so I will excuse the witnesses. Thank you very much for being here today, and you're excused. Thanks.
Merci. Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye.
I'll wait for them to step out and give them the floor after.
So we're still webcast, and the Zoom witness has left. And
the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was saying, I would like to move the motion that was circulated last week regarding the global carbon tax that Canada has quietly supported despite claiming that they do not. Now, for those that weren't here last year, as Minister of Environment, Stephen Guilbeault appeared at this very committee where I asked him regarding a quote that was in the media immediately prior to the meeting where he was quoted as saying he was very supportive of the global carbon levy. He went on to claim that that was simply not true and dispute that he had said anything of such nature. He went on to tweet further that, quote, they were not supporting any such international levy. Then, lo and behold, we found out that that was simply not true. And in April, while he was still the Minister of Environment, the Liberal government went on to support and vote in favor of the regulations at a session of the International Maritime Organization on April 11th of this year. And just this past week, the UN's International Maritime Organization met again to consider the adoption of the IMO Net Zero framework. Now, make no mistake, this will lead to a massive carbon tax on international shipping that will raise absolutely the price of every good that we bring into this country and leaves this country. Now, not only did Minister Guilbeault tell this committee something that was simply not true at the time, at no point has the Liberal government ever said anything about hoisting this new carbon tax on Canadians. As such, I would move the motion that I will not read into the entirety of the record, but it involves inviting Minister Guilbeault as well as the current Transportation Minister, the Honourable Stephen McKinnon, to appear to provide clarity on the government's actual position regarding the global tax on shipping. And I will pause there, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie. Debate. Mrs. Yildiba.
Okay. I'm wondering if the committee would find it useful if we were to actually ask for a study. And so to instead of ask for a couple of presentations, to maybe alternatively say, given that the International Maritime Organization is hosting an extraordinary session from October 14th to 17th, 2025, the committee undertake a study relating to maritime sector decarbonization that would give more of a fulsome analysis on this particular issue.
Mr. Bonnet.
C'est un sujet en effet très intéressant.
This is an interesting and important topic. I think it may be going too fast to think about a study. I think discussing it will help us find out if we need to go further with the topic and clarify the government's position on the matter. I think that is the initial step for us here. I proposed some amendments to my colleague's motion. I believe there could be consensus and help simplify the discussions. I don't know if those amendments are available and were shared. I think the proposal should be made. Essentially, I would remove the first part, starting with given that, right up to that the minister was in favor of a tax. I will replace that with given that Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, MP, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, made statements that could be considered contradictory on the position of the government concerning the implementation of a global carbon tax for maritime transportation. Was I speaking too fast? So that will be it. And then after that, we will continue by adding that the committee invites Minister Julie Dubrensin, Minister of Climate Change, to appear for an hour, and also invite Honorable Stephen McKinnon, Minister of Transport. I think that will be a second amendment, one at a time. Okay, let's start with the first one. So on the first amendment,
on his first amendment?
Yep.
Go ahead.
I tend to agree with, I don't know if we need a study until we get some clarity from the government, so I think that's something we could look at some point in the future. In the meantime, I'd be willing to accept that a friendly amendment to alter the motion to bring in the current minister despite the claims of the previous minister, but I think it's relevant to have the current minister here as well, so I will be supporting both of the amendments.
Monsieur Leslie, Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
Thank you, Mr. Saint-Pierre. Point of order, I would like to see a copy of the amendments because maybe amendments were exchanged and I have nothing physical in front of me. So I would like to see a copy of the amendment so I can make an analysis and arrive at my judgment. So you want a copy because right now we are talking about one amendment. Mr. Bones, could you give us a written version of the amendment? I think your colleagues received it. Maybe you have not yet received it, but work was done a few minutes ago.
It came in by email. We're distributing it now.
Donc, chers collègues, le greffier m'a...
The clerk is telling me that he is sending it to you by email. So please check your inboxes.
It's just taking a moment. You might want to suspend, in fact.
You want me to suspend? Attendre la réception du courriel.
We are waiting to receive the email.
been sent out. Monsieur Saint-Pierre, vous avez bel et bien reçu le courriel. Parfait.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, did you receive the email? Perfect. Do you want to comment now? Perfect.
No debate? Debate on that First Amendment? Mr. Fanjoy?
I'd just like to address the fact that this is a new government. We have a new Minister of the Environment. The last government suggested, may have made comments. People make comments all the time. It was never introduced as a potential law. It wasn't a regulation. This is just a comment that was made by a previous government. And if this committee is going to make it our practice to call former ministers or even current ministers over speculative comments that they made years ago that are not before the current government, then we're going to spend an inordinate amount of time chasing shadows, and that's not the purpose of this committee. If the government wants to make a statement, weigh in on this issue, then at that point it's within the scope of committee business to ask for clarification on the government's position, but that hasn't happened. So I think that this motion is just a waste of the committee's time. We're trying to deal with some substantive issues, addressing the current study. We have other studies in the queue, and I see no value brought by going on a fishing expedition based on what someone said some time ago in a previous government.
Mr. Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not see it as a waste of time to try to find out some clarity on the current so-called new government's position on a massive tax that will increase the price of everything across Canada for every single Canadian. Now, it is a live issue because just this past week, we would have had Canadian representatives at this table deciding whether or not to ratify this decision. I think it is entirely reasonable to bring forward the relevant ministers to better understand whether or not Canada does support, whether it's the last Liberal government, this Liberal government, hopefully never another future Liberal government, they support a global tax on shipping. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Barnett.
En tout respect pour...
With all due respect for my honourable colleague, the issue of maritime transportation is significant. It's about 3% of global emissions. It's not regulated through the Paris Agreement. Emissions are rising. The Sorel Pole project, for example, is one example of that. So it's constructive to have the government come present its reflections and its position, clarify what was said or not said in the past, because right now we are not sure. Without having it in the Paris Agreement, we need to be concerned about that. We have the Japan agreement that covers maritime transportation, so I think it's important for us to have a construction discussion on that matter.
Thank you. I'd just like to take a moment to apologize to the two witnesses that were just here before us, as their time was cut short and we weren't able to have them fulfill their full hour. It's a big time commitment and a lot of preparation for these witnesses to appear before us, and I value their time. Thank you.
Mrs. Miedema, for your comments. For the debate? For the debate?
The First Amendment of Mr. Bonnet.
So, we'll be voting.
Sorry, can I bring some amendments to the motion?
To the sub-amendment to the amendment?
Which amendment are we?
The First Amendment.
The one that you received, the last one you received, the only one you received by email.
So it's the one.
Because you stopped Mr. Bonan, he was about, so whereabouts are, where is this First Amendment? Because you said one amendment at a time. So I'm looking at this and can you read it out?
In the email.
Mr. Clerk, can I ask you to read it out so all members can be clear as to where exactly we are?
Yes, sir. Monsieur Bonin's First Amendment replaces the preamble up until the words "to adopt these regulations" with, given that the Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, PCMP, then Minister of Environment and Climate Change, allegedly made statements that could be considered contradictory regarding the government's position on the implementation of a global carbon tax on maritime transport, that the committee, etc. That's the amendment that the committee is debating. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
Can I add amendments to
sub-amendment?
Sub-amendments.
Go ahead.
Monsieur le Président, pardon, un appel au règlement.
Chair, call to order. I just realized that, I'm sorry, it's because of my inexperience, but what I started saying as an amendment was one amendment, not two amendments. So I did not conclude because it was interpreted as being two amendments. But what has been sent out is one amendment, not two.
Me dit que si vous êtes en train de...
So you are amending two parts. So that becomes two amendments. But we are still on the First Amendment that everyone received by email. Mr. St. Pierre. This is a minor amendment.
The Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, just to change the word honourable to add a U, and it's HONORABLE. Sorry, I was a lawyer before in a previous life, so I just want to be very precise on the language. So my sub-amendment would be to add a U in the honourable. Thank you.
You can kill the mic.
So the clerk advises that he has the power to make any corrections. Therefore, no worry about the spelling.
Can I propose another sub-amendment?
Go ahead.
My colleague is quite excited when I propose sub-amendments. So then we say that then Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I would add a sub-amendment that we add Quebec Lieutenant and Minister responsible for official languages, or capture his current title. And that we delete then Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So we're referring to
His present title.
Current title.
So is the sub-amendment accepted? All in favor? Nays? So the sub-amendment has been accepted. Now we're going to go to the amendment.
As amended.
As amended.
Debate.
All debate.
All those in favor?
All in favor?
Opposed?
All against? Opposed?
Okay.
Thank you.
So the First Amendment is adopted.
Donc votre premier amendement est adopté.
Your first amendment is adopted. Can we now move on to the second one? Certainly, Mr. Chair. This would be to remove International Maritime Organization. We delete that. We intend to adopt this regulation. The committee invites the Honorable Julie Daberson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, to appear for 1 hour. Invite the Honorable Stephen McKinnon, Minister of Transport, to appear for 1 hour, and at the end, we delete that they both appear within 7 days following adoption of this motion. We delete that part.
looks like they were all in.
So for debate on this Second Amendment, I'm supportive of asking Minister DeBrusen to come on this. I'm wondering if it could be entertained to not also ask a second minister of Minister McKinnon to come and just have Minister DeBrusen cover this conversation due to capacity and also fit. Thank you.
Who would be the second
Mr. Bonnet, pardon?
Who would be the second minister?
Who? Sorry, just to complete your thought, who would be the second minister?
None.
None?
Only DeBrusen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Monsieur Bonnet?
Considering that it's the minister who is responsible, the committee is attached to a minister, I would like to support that only the minister appear.
Propose that as her own amendment.
Mr. Leslie, did you have your hand up?
Yes. I would say because it is a transport-related issue, it would be beneficial, I think, to have the Minister of Transportation here at the same time. And secondly, given Minister DeBrusen's apparent reluctance to come to this committee, I'm worried that she may try to ignore this important meeting at some point happening in the future. I would like to leave both, but if the will of the committee is to just have one, then that is acceptable to me.
I'm just objecting to the apparent reluctance. You have no evidence that there's any reluctance. It's just
not a point of order.
So,
Monsieur Saint-Pierre?
Yeah, it's not urgent, could wait, but I'd like to bring some sub-amendments when one...
For the Second Amendment?
Yeah, exactly, thank you.
So again, Ms. Miedema's suggestion is outside.
Advising me, Mrs. Miedema, that what you've stated is out of scope, so you'd have to propose it as an amendment. So we'll complete the Second Amendment that was stated by Mr. Bonnet, and now we will be dealing with Monsieur Saint-Pierre, who wants to make a sub-amendment to the Second Amendment. Is that correct? No.
Well, maybe it's going back to my previous point around the honorable, so just being really nitpicky here. So instead of HON, if we could do honorable, and also for to appear for 1 hour, I would propose it to appear for no more than 1 hour would be my proposed sub-amendment.
So that's outside the scope again. So we'll have to wait to propose it as an amendment.
Okay. So the clerk is advising me it's outside the scope. You'd have to wait to propose it again afterwards. So on the Second Amendment that was forwarded by Mr. Bonnet, any further debate on that?
All those in favor?
I'm getting confused with all the proposed sub-amendments that were out of scope. Can you, thank you.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
Mr. Clerk, can you please reread the Second Amendment proposed by Mr. Bonnet?
Yep. So the Second Amendment by Mr. Bonnet replaces the invitation from the committee inviting Minister Guilbeault to inviting the Honourable Julie DeBrusen, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, to appear for 1 hour.
All clear? For the debate on this? All in favor? Against? Second Amendment has been adopted. Mrs. Miedema.
Just try again here now. I would like to propose an amendment to remove the second invitation for the Honourable Minister McKinnon and to only have it be Minister DeBrusen. Thank you.
Debate?
All those in favor?
All those in favor? All those against?
4, adopted.
Adopted. Remember there was another, Mr. St. Pierre, now is the moment to present. You're okay?
Now, there's one other, there's a couple other amendments from Mr. Bonnet.
Bonnet, yeah.
One
C'est à votre troisième amendement?
Is that a third amendment?
to
So, le troisième amendement,
Mr. Bonnet's third amendment reads as follows. If I understand well, the amendment proposes that we delete the sentence to explain contradictory comments.
is deleting the phrase to explain his contradictory comments.
debate?
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed?
Oppose?
Right, adopted. And then there's one final one.
Monsieur Bonnet, votre dernier amendement?
Mr. Bonnet, your last amendment. Mr. Clerk, could you please tell us what it is? If I understand you well, the last amendment is to delete the sentence and request that they both appear within 7 days following the adoption of this motion.
The motion, and that they both appear within 7 days following the adoption of this motion. Thank you. Merci.
Debate? Monsieur St. Pierre?
So if I may, can I ask a question about the necessity of the 7 days? So why 7 days specifically? So it's just more of a question.
Mr. Leslie?
At the time, the decision was to be made on Friday. By Friday was the expected timeline, so therefore the urgency allows, it seems as there's been a deferral of some sort, so I'm okay not having them here as urgently.
You're okay with removing the 7 days from the motion? Okay. Would you be replacing it with an additional amount of days, or you would just remove the 7 days?
I think it's an opportunity for the minister to show that she wants to be part of this committee and avail herself as quickly as possible.
If I may, one last time. So there's no sense of urgency, is what I'm hearing.
It'll run at government speed.
Can you please define what government speed means to a rookie MP? Thank you. I'm looking at you as an experienced member of Parliament, so curious to get your perspective on speed.
Mr. Chair, I'm okay removing that particular section as proposed. I do want to leave it open-ended because it is that sense of emergency or urgency has been removed with the deferral of the ratification of the decision that we voted on earlier in April as a country. But I don't think we want to let it linger. But I know the minister has also been asked to appear on at least 2 other topics. So add this to the docket, and my hope is that the clerk will be able to find mutual times that the minister can appear on all of the upcoming appearances that she is slated to have before this committee.
Thank you. Appreciate that clarification. So maybe just a question, if the motion is less urgent than it appeared, just have a question about some thoughts that we had or some questions around the current study that we were studying today with the witnesses on the ERP. I had a question about how many days, because we were initially scheduled to have 4 days to 6 days. And so I think that's important to eventually discuss how many days we'll want for the ERP study. No, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, but given the fact that this motion isn't urgent, I think it's worth addressing that point at some point.
Mr. Leslie.
Just, Mr. Chair, clarification. Did we pass this motion finally? I think we need to pass that first, and we're not in committee business, so I think we'll probably have to defer that other important conversation. But I think we should make sure we pass this without accidentally closing the meeting off.
Based on your analysis.
Well, I guess I would just question relevance on where we went on the end there.
Further debate?
Further debate.
All those in favor of the amendment?
All those in favor of the third amendment Fourth Amendment presented by Mr. Bonnet.
That's all right. That's 9.
9,
No
carried.
opposed, all right.
No opposed.
So now the motion as amended.
So now we're going to go on the motion as amended. All in favor?
Opposed?
Opposed?
All right. 7-2.
That we're voting on right now?
The vote was taken, sir. I can reread the motion that was adopted.
It's because there's a bit of confusion on that side with respect to what they were voting. I saw that. Sure, you can reread the motion, please.
Yes, sir. The motion as amended is, given that the Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, PC, MP, Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture and Minister responsible for official languages, allegedly made statements that could be considered contradictory regarding the government's position on the implementation of a global carbon tax on maritime transport, that the committee invite the Honourable Julie DeBrusin, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, to appear for 1 hour to provide clarity on the government's position regarding the global carbon tax on shipping.
So for the benefit of the doubt, I'll ask to bring it to a vote. All in favor?
6. Opposed?
Opposed?
3. It's carried.
Carried. That's it.
I hope so. Any other business?
Any other business? Mr. Saint-Pierre?
Right. So referring to the motion that we were hearing witnesses today, I would just like to get some clarity on whether that's going to be a study over 4 days or a study over 6 days. I believe we are in the 4th day. Today was the 4th day of the ERP study, so I just want some clarity as thinking forward on the scheduling, whether we'll be going to 4 or 6.
I'll ask the clerk to address this question.
Thank you, sir. At a previous meeting, the committee agreed that witnesses appearing for 1 hour constitutes a half meeting. So today is meeting number 3. Thursday, October 23, is meeting number 4. Under the instruction of the chair, I have invited witnesses on the committee's behalf to appear also on Monday, October 27, which would be meeting number 5. For the reference of members, 5 meetings would entail a total of 30 witnesses for the study, if the committee stayed at 5 witnesses. 15 have been allocated to the Liberal Party, 14 were invited, 10 have confirmed, 2 have declined, 2 have not responded, 12 are allocated to the Conservative Party, 11 are confirmed, 1 is pending, 3 have declined, and 1 has not responded. And to the Bloc Québécois, 3 are allocated, 3 have been invited and confirmed, and either appeared, I believe the 3rd appeared today. I hope that responds to your question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Any further comments? Mr.
Just
Saint-Pierre?
make one last friendly statement. I don't think there'll be any disagreement on this, but I just like to wish my colleagues, Mrs. Anstey, happy birthday from last week, and also my colleague, Mr. Leslie, on the birth of his new child. So I know a lot happens in a week, so I just want to reach out to my colleagues and congratulate them on their significant life events.
Thank you so much.
Noted. I respect the same. Mr. Grant.
So having said that, are we? Congratulations! I already said congratulations to you. I don't need to say it. I don't need to say it again. Are we going to make a decision on the amount of meetings for this study? I think that we have a number of witnesses outstanding still, and I think we can make that decision or that discussion, or?
Yes, Mr. Leslie. I'm seeing you're eager to share comments with me.
I actually, surprisingly, not that eager. I'm just so happy to have our collegiality across the way here, and thank you, Mr. St. No, so it just sounds like we have a fifth meeting booked on Monday, and it was 4 to 6. We'll need more time to figure out how we're going to go forward, I think, rather than right now.
Can I make a deal? Maybe this will be the first one that I'll succeed in getting from all the parties. If the clerk has more witnesses, then we'll move to a sixth. Is that okay? And if anybody else has any more witnesses they'd like to bring that they haven't brought forward, this is the moment.
No, but I think as I looked at the calendar that was circulated recently today, maybe, I think the forward-looking calendar generally looked good. So I would happily stick with what was sent out.
So my deal didn't get accepted. I'm disappointed.
If it's helpful, I'm happy to provide some additional witnesses.
Mr. Grant?
C'est plus une question, donc si il y a...
It's more of a question, actually. If there were to be a sixth meeting, what would the date be? It would be the week after the fifth meeting. So the meetings would be consecutive. So the next meeting is a Thursday. That'll be the fourth meeting. Then the following Monday will be the fifth. And then if necessary, that following Thursday would be the sixth meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.